Hello, Professor Jim Albrecht here, and today we're studying Benjamin Franklin's Autobiography, a very influential work of colonial American literature and a very influential work in terms of the genre of American autobiography, and I think a really great read from the 18th century. Reading 18th century prose may be a little foreign to your ear, but I think once you get into it, you'll see that Franklin is a really interesting and engaging character and an interesting thinker in American culture. So we're going to look at a couple of passages together, and I hope that will give you ideas for going back into the rest of the reading from Franklin so that you'll be able to come back with ideas and issues that you'll want to share with the rest of the class. So we'll be working on skills of literary study, as always, and particularly today, how genre shapes meaning, genre being a type of literature, and the genre we are dealing with here is autobiography. And although autobiography tells a real life story, is the real facts of somebody's life, it is still an artistically shaped narrative, one that uses the same types of formal elements that fictional stories like novels use. So we have a character and characters in the autobiography, and we can think about what kind of a hero or protagonist the author is in his or her own story, how as a character he changes or develops through the course of the narrative, what kinds of positive or negative traits he embodies, and what kind of appeal does this character have for the readers? Why do we like reading this autobiography? Autobiographies, like novels, have plots. That's the events, the things that happen in a story with conflicts and challenges, achievements and failures, and the protagonist, the hero, grows or develops in some way. Autobiographies have themes like novels do. And if plot refers to the events, what happens in a story, themes are the larger social issues that are raised and explored through a story. And then there's the question of the narrator or the narrative perspective, which is one of the most interesting elements of an autobiography. So we love to read stories of other people's lives. And one of the great appeals of autobiography is the fact that we hear about somebody else's life not secondhand, so not from a biographer who's writing about somebody else's life, but firsthand from the person who actually lived the life themselves. And another of the complexities of a narrator in an autobiography is there's a kind of a duality or a doubleness to the narrator. Because the author is at the same time a character in the plot that's being narrated and the person who's telling the story. Oftentimes this involves the author as an older self looking back on and telling a story about his or her younger self. So autobiography is kind of the public construction of a self, of an identity, and that's happening on two levels, both in the plot, the story that's being told, but also simultaneously from moment to moment as we read, the author is presenting him or herself through the way that he tells the story of his younger self. So that's a very interesting element of autobiography and one that I hope we can see in operation in Franklin. So in terms of themes, I've asked you to think about how Franklin's autobiography is involved quite explicitly in promoting or constructing a new model of American selfhood. It's a very interesting example of literature being used very explicitly to help forge a new national identity. When you create a new nation, you don't just need a new government, you need a shared culture, a common sense of identity or values between the citizens so that that new government and nation can function. So in what ways is Franklin presenting himself in this narrative as an exemplary American? And this can be in the trajectory or path of his life story. What kind of life story is this? But also in terms of the character traits or cultural attitudes that Franklin seems to embody that might seem to us as typically American as we read back on his autobiography. So themes such as education and literacy, work and economic gain, morality and religion, science, his relations with other people, and his view of human nature, including how one can shape or cultivate or remake one's self. So I thought we would look at two passages today, both of which deal with Franklin's vegetarianism. Full disclosure, I'm a vegetarian, so I find these quite interesting to read about Ben Franklin being a vegetarian in his younger days. So here's the first one. When I was about 16 years of age, I happened to meet with a book written by one Tryon, recommending a vegetable diet. I determined to go into it. My brother, being yet unmarried, did not keep house, but boarded himself and his apprentices in another family. My refusing to eat flesh occasioned an inconveniency, and I was frequently chid for my singularity. I made myself acquainted with Tryon's manner of preparing his dishes, such as boiling potatoes with rice, making hasty pudding, and a few others, and then proposed to my brother that if he would give me weekly half the money he paid for my board, I would board myself. He instantly agreed to it, and I presently found that I could save half what he paid me. This was an additional fund for buying books. But I had another advantage in it. My brother and the rest going from the printing house to their meals, I remained there alone, and dispatching presently my slight repast, which often was no more than a biscuit or a slice of bread, a handful of raisins or a tart from the pastry cook's, and a glass of water, had the rest of the time till their return for study, in which I made the greater progress from that greater clearness of head and quicker apprehension which usually attend temperance in eating and drinking. Now, what character traits or cultural attitudes does young Ben Franklin demonstrate in this episode from his youth? What about his attitude toward money and work and economizing? What about his attitudes towards books and education? He's taking ideas from a book and applying them, putting them into practice in his own life. And when he gets money, he's using it to buy books, right? He's interested in furthering his education. He's also demonstrating individual initiative, coming up with this plan about how he can save money and invest it in his future in terms of education. And he's showing himself to be a shrewd business person because he's, in a way, his brother thinks that the brother's getting a good deal, but in fact, Franklin is getting a better deal. He's also showing himself to have temperance, to have control over his own bodily appetites, and to delay gratification in terms of eating so that he can put more energy into work and education. And he's also deliberately working on cultivating or improving himself, intellectually, economically, morally. So how do all these things fuse together in a kind of an American fusion of values? I think is a good compact example from Franklin, and you may see more of these kinds of ideas coming up in other parts of his narrative. Now, a little further on in the autobiography, we have another story about his vegetarianism, and this one he's on a boat, and let me pick up this story. I believe I have omitted mentioning that in my first voyage from Boston, being becalmed off Block Island, our people set about catching cod and hauled up a great many. Hitherto I had stuck to my resolution of not eating animal food, and on this occasion I considered with my master Tryon the taking every fish as a kind of unprovoked murder, since none of them had or ever could do us any injury that might justify the slaughter. All this seemed very reasonable. But I had formerly been a great lover of fish, and when this came hot out of the frying pan, it smelt admirably well. I balanced some time between principle and inclination, till I recollected that when the fish were opened, I saw smaller fish taken out of their stomachs. Then, thought I, if you eat one another, I don't see why we mayn't eat you. So I dined upon cod very heartily, and continued to eat with other people, returning only now and then occasionally to a vegetable diet. So convenient a thing it is to be a reasonable creature, since it enables one to find or make a reason for everything one has a mind to do. Now, what kind of attitude or tone towards human nature do we get in this passage? What are the different ways that a reader might react to Franklin here? We could, I suppose, view him as a hypocrite, somebody who adopts principles when they turn out to be beneficial to him, but when he's willing to abandon them in order to suit other desires of his. Or we could stress his honesty here, that he describes himself on the one hand as motivated by sincere ethical principles in terms of being a vegetarian, that he cares about not slaughtering other animals unjustly. But on the other hand, he's honest that he's driven by inclinations, by appetite, by desires. And he rehearses for us how his younger self worked out this problem, and he used his facility at ethical reasoning to basically justify with his principles what he wanted to do, which was eat the fish because he was hungry and they smelled good, right? And the tone here is very important. It's a funny story, right? And it's funny because Franklin is willing to make a joke at his own expense. He acknowledges that he, like most human beings, is a reasonable creature, because he can come up with a reason for doing what he wants to do, what he desires to do. So this episode offers a really different tone from the one we just looked at. The earlier one presents Franklin as a very thrifty, rational, hardworking, industrious character, very much in control of his appetites. Whereas this one is more charitable, more ironic, a little bit more amused at recognizing and even relishing the foibles of human nature. And I think one of the real pleasures and complexities of reading Franklin is seeing these different sides, almost different personas that he's willing to offer up to us. As a writer, as a personality, as a thinker, as a psychologist or a moralist, somebody who's trying to work out in his own life a prescription for what it means to live a good and successful life. So I hope that spending some time close reading these couple of passages have piqued your interest, whetted your appetite, your curiosity for Franklin, and that you'll return to the rest of the book. And I hope that it has alerted you to some of the pleasures of reading this very interesting 18th century autobiography from a really very intriguing character in American history. So, happy reading. I look forward to seeing what kinds of ideas and responses you come up with as you explore other scenes and other sections of Franklin's autobiography. Thanks.